Time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern is a 27-year veteran with the CIA. As an intelligence briefer for President Reagan from 1981 through 1985, he was in charge of preparing daily security briefs for the president, the vice president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the cabinet, and the National Security Advisor. Later, he was one of several senior CIA analysts who prepared the president's daily brief for President George Herbert Walker Bush. Upon retirement, he was awarded the Intelligence Commendation Medal from President George Herbert Walker Bush, which he later returned, and worked for Washington-based nonprofits before becoming a co-director of the Servant Leadership School in Washington, D.C. He is co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPs. VIPs is dedicated to exposing the mishandling of important intelligence, specifically relating to the war in Iraq. Ray, thank you very much for spending time with us again this morning.
You're most welcome, Mike.
Let's start out. You have just returned from a 2-week trip to Palestine and Israel. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I was privileged to join a delegation from the Interfaith Peace Builders, which is an offshoot from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. They run tours to the West Bank, Golan Heights, Israel, a couple times a year. For small delegations, we were 11. They're very well plugged in with justice people on both sides of the issue, Israelis and Palestinians. And so it was a really uncommon exposure to what's going on in that part of the world. It's very distressing, of course, because our government, the U.S. government, that is responsible for a lot of the oppression that's happening in the occupied territories. Americans really don't often hear that Israel has occupied large areas of Palestinian land for 40 years. I mean, that's longer than the Soviets were in Eastern Europe. And the occupation is rather brutal. People also don't know how it all started back in 1948 when the State of Israel was created and what the Palestinians referred to as the Nakba, which is the destruction of their peoplehood and their state. 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes and sought refuge in neighboring states or in the enclaves that exist now. And so it's a very tough problem because one of the difficulties one runs into is telling this story in a straight way without appearing to be anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic or that kind of thing. And one runs great risk of doing that, particularly if one is a politician or one needs some funding for something. And thankfully, I'm not a politician, and nothing against politicians, of course, and I don't need funding for anything, despite the efforts of some Republican members of the Intelligence Committee last year. My pension has not yet been revoked. I kid you not. They tried to do that. And so I have enough to live on. And the leader of our group, I'll just say this much here, he's a Jew, a third-generation Palestinian Jew, actually. And he made the trip last year, and this year he was guiding it, and he has already written some sentences which I think are very powerful, coming from a very committed American Jew who traces his antecedents back. Well, he was visiting cousins in Jerusalem, even as we were on this delegation last couple of weeks. He said, "To our Christian sisters and brothers, I say, do not, out of a sense of guilt for what happened during World War II, don't give Israel, the state of Israel, a free pass. Don't confuse anti-Semitism with a critique of Israel, because in so doing, you fail to hold Israel responsible for the choices that it's made. To make this mistake, you allow yourselves to be, I will use the word, bullied by the threat of the charge of anti-Semitism, and that's to commit a pernicious fallacy, because as Jews, we sought political self-determination and we got it. Now we must behave in accordance with the principles of justice and in accordance with international law as an expression of universally agreed upon principles of justice. As Jews, we are confronted daily with this choice as we witness the illegal and oppressive actions of the Jewish state of Israel for the Palestinian people, it is so rapidly displacing. In a word, the idea is to drive the Palestinians out, not only out of the West Bank, but out of Israel proper. There are just too many of them. What we have is a deliberate policy of cleansing, ethnic cleansing. It's not like the Holocaust because these people aren't being burned in crematoria. They're being burned slowly, a slow boil, like that proverbial frog. But they're hurting, and it doesn't look possible that they will have a viable state, no matter all the rhetoric on both sides here, and that the responsibility for that is largely our country. For each settlement that goes up on each mountaintop or hill in the Jerusalem area or the West Bank, the funding that we are giving the State of Israel enables that. And we just pledged to give them $30 billion, I repeat, $billion over the next 10 years. Now people say, oh, that's for armaments, that's to defend themselves. Well, I asked about that. There's no way to trace how they use that money. They can use it for other purposes, but that frees their budget to use additional monies to create these settlements. And when I'm talking settlements, I'm talking little towns on all the hilltops in the West Bank that have any significance. And as you see these things gleaming white in the sunlight, and you look down at the Palestinian villages that they dominate, you say, my goodness, what's going on here? And then you look more closely, and you find out these settlements are only 40% occupied. They can't get enough people out of New York and New Jersey to come and settle there. And so what are they doing? They're creating, as they put it, facts on the ground. Facts on the ground which make it, in their view, impossible to have a truly Palestinian state on the West Bank because there'll be just too many Jewish settlers to displace. We're talking hundreds of thousands now. So it's a very, very sad sort of situation, but I think the key is to allow American listeners and American viewers to face up to this and say, look, it's not only unconscionable that we step aside and watch this happen, but it's really unconscionable for us to allow our legislators and our executive authorities to keep funding this kind of indignity there. And I say that out of just a spirit of justice. And if there's anything that rings true in the Judeo-Christian ethos that I grew up in, it's that this Yahweh of the Old Testament and Jesus of the New, they really only care about one thing, and that is that we do justice. And to see us falling so far short of that pains me as a person of faith, as well as a Realpolitik guy, because Realpolitik, well, they're not going to do it. It's a terribly myopic view. When you think that a Palestinian with access to the web, to Google Maps, and a little mortar can target and will target not only our embassy in Baghdad, but Israeli settlements as well, the time is far past to have the kind of security that Israel aspires to by force of arms. They're going to have to talk this out. I don't think there's going to be a real Holocaust there, and unless they decide to kill all the Palestinians, which I doubt they will, there's going to have to be some sort of accommodation. And the fact that our country stands in the way of that, and that the policy of this administration, its very first National Security Council meeting on the 30th of January 2001, started out by President George W. Bush saying, we're going to change our policy toward Israel-Palestine. We know this fellow Ariel Sharon, we're going to give him his head. And when Colin Powell, surprised as he was, it would have been nice if the president had asked the Secretary of State whether, it would be a good idea, but Powell was completely surprised. And he said, well, that could be very dangerous. He could really send his tanks into Palestine. And why the president would say, well, sometimes a show of force can be a good thing, And how do we know this? He said, well, McGovern, how do you know that? Well, I know that because Paul O'Neill, the Secretary of Treasury, was there, okay? He's written about it. And he was shocked. He was just shocked that only the president and Cheney seemed to know about this profound change in policy where, far from being an honest broker anymore, we were going to throw our complete weight to our friends in Israel. And as I say, the supreme irony is witness what happened in Lebanon just a year ago, the supreme irony is that this is an incredibly myopic attitude toward the policy, toward the real events in the Middle East, and that it's in the long term, not in the long-term interest or even the medium-term interest of Israel to hold on to this notion that might makes right, and that will just completely dominate that part of the area because modern weaponry being what it is, they're just not going to be able to succeed. And when Bush is long gone, their best friend is long gone, Israel's going to have to face this, and it's not going to be a pretty picture unless they change their attitude.
I believe I read in some of your writings you talked about where Bush actually seems to get more of his intel and policy coming out of those in Israel than his own people.
Yeah, this is something bizarre that most people don't know. There's always been sort of an inclination to give the Israelis the benefit of the doubt in our government, and to some extent even in our intelligence community. We had to sort of fight against that, you know. But, 2 days ago, I was in Ramallah, where Arafat had his headquarters, where the Israeli tanks came in and demolished everything around him, left the building standing where his office was, only a couple of stories of it. And until then, he had been, as Colin Powell, as Secretary of State, said, the freely elected, recognized representative of the Palestinian people, okay? Now, what changed that? Well, I'll tell you what changed that. The Israelis kept feeding us reports. And when I say us, I don't mean the CIA. That's the channel that by law they're supposed to go through, Israeli intelligence. But they had free access to Rumsfeld and the Pentagon, to Feith and to Cheney, and they fed reports that Arafat was importing arms and doing all kinds of dastardly things. And finally, when Powell was out of town one day, one week, the president said, no longer will we talk to Yasser Arafat. He's not the universally recognized representative of the Palestinian people. Major, profound change. And from then on, Israel had free reign with him. Now, I talked to a lot of people in Israel and in Washington, and the question, of course, as to how Arafat perished is very, very delicate. He was poisoned by some sort of agent that not even the Swiss and German doctors could figure out what it was. And Palestinians just assumed it was Israeli intelligence.
And I believe also in your writings you had mentioned when the Saudis had visited Bush at his Crawford Ranch.
Yeah, that was so revealing. This comes from Ron Suskind's book. I don't know how he gets these sources, but it's incredible. Yeah, the Saudis were coming to really kind of have a tete-a-tete with the president. Suffice it to say that Cheney had intercepted the talking points that had been meticulously prepared for the president and boiled down to 2 pages, okay, so that he would actually be tempted to read it. And the president wasn't at all prepared to talk to this key ally. And the Saudis were just mystified. And right in the middle, as they're just getting into the subject, the president says, come on, I'll show you around the ranch. Come on, I'll show you. He gets into his little pickup with the virtual king, and they drive around for an hour, and everyone else is standing open-mouthed and sort of gasped at the fact that nothing is happening at this key meeting. So what it told me, among other things, was the fact that, the State Department people and the NSC, National Security Council people who were there, investigated and found out that the briefing documents, such as they were, prepared for Bush, were intercepted by Cheney in his office. And so, Cheney is really kind of the bottleneck here. He allows the president to read or to be briefed on whatever he chooses. And the only changes in our policy, and this is sort of interesting, I think, the only changes in our policy come when the Secretary of State or Cheney are out of town. As you know, this administration has refused to talk to the Iranians. Why? Well, because they're one of the points on the axis of evil, and the president said they're evil, so we don't. It used to be we had a State Department, and their job was to talk to everybody, even the bad guys. I mean, when I was working on Soviet strategic armaments, and we were trying to conclude agreements with them. We were able to persuade Ronald Reagan that not only were the Soviets interested in disarmament, bad guys, evil empire that they were, but they would be able to agree to the kind of agreement that we could monitor. The famous doverai but proverai, the Russian meaning, trust but verify, okay? Ronald Reagan's favorite thing. Well, we were the guys that verified, okay? And to his great credit, he took us at face value and went ahead and did. And now if Ronald Reagan can negotiate with the evil empire, why can't George W. Bush talk to the Iranians, who are nowhere near a nuclear weapon? Well, I'll tell you why. One of the main reasons why is because the Israelis and Dick Cheney are telling the president Iran is going to be a great threat to the state of Israel and eventually to us. And when General Brent Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor to the president's father, and who, there isn't anybody who knows more about what the world is like from Washington's perspective than General Brent Scowcroft, when he says, as he did 2.5 years ago, when he told the Financial Times that Ariel Sharon, at the time, has our president wrapped around his little finger, that he has our president mesmerized, that gives me great pause. And I say to myself, wow, here's the super discreet former national security advisor, and at the time, chair of the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, most prestigious overseer of intelligence there is in Washington, under George W. Bush. What prompted him to go to the Financial Times and say, look, you need to know that Ariel Sharon has our president wrapped around his little finger. He's got him mesmerized. I think he was trying to tell the American people, look, this is a very dangerous situation because, what will happen in Iran now? Well, all bets are off. It depends on who talks to the president last. Now, when Cheney, about 6 weeks ago, was traveling around in Asia, in Afghanistan, Condoleezza Rice got to the president and said, everybody thinks this refusal to talk to the Iranians is really for the birds. I mean, we're being ridiculed right and left, even by some people in Congress, Republicans. So we ought to change that. And the president said, sounds good to me. So let's talk to them. Now, that was a change of policy. Susskind says that he read a White House memo which talked about how you influence the president. And what the memo said was, be the last to brief the president on any given day. Okay? Well, I don't think it's a stretch to say Condoleezza Rice was the last. Cheney was out of town. Major change in policy. Well, all of a sudden, we're talking to the Iranians. What happens next? The vice president shows up on a aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf with jet fighters behind him and says, we're never going to let the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. We're never going to let the Iranians fool around in Iraq like they are and so forth. So there's a real tug of war going on in Washington about how to do these things. And the sorrowful thing and the dangerous thing is that Cheney always wins.
You are co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and sanity is one of the things I believe you guys brought into question in terms of George Bush in an article you guys wrote?
Yes. This is a rather unusual article that we put out 3 weeks ago now. It's called Dangers, a President in the Corner. What will he do? A cornered President George Bush. We sought counsel, as we used to when we were active analysts in the CIA, from all kinds of disciplines, including psychology. We had a whole unit that was devoted to analyzing foreign leaders, their psyches, their childhoods, what made them tick and how they might be susceptible to being influenced in negotiations and things like that. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would be commissioning such a study on the President of the United States. But Dr. Justin Frank, a psychoanalyst in Washington, had written this book called Bush on the Couch. And we got together and said, what needs to happen now with the president getting himself cornered, how is he going to react? We know enough about him for these last 6+ years to add to what Justin Frank, Dr. Frank had already written in Bush on the Couch, let's ask Dr. Frank if he'd talk to us and maybe update what he's done. And he was thinking of the same thing. And so, make a long story short, 3 weeks later, we put out this memorandum, and we set the stage, and then we have Dr. Frank commenting on Bush's psyche, his approach to life, the fact that he is, in a very real sense, a sociopath, that when you grow up, blowing up frogs with firecrackers, that this is an indication of sort of a lack of empathy. Colleen Rowley, who's one of our veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, commented that he couldn't get a job with the FBI if we found out that he blew up frogs with firecrackers, even if he was only 6 years old. That's a sign. That's a sign of a person that we don't want to have working for us. So we put this all together and adduced three scenarios. One would be an Israeli and/or Israeli-U.S. attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities. How would the president sort of be influenced or react to that? One was a resolution by Congress to go ahead and defund the war. There's really no comfort in saying, well, the Constitution says Congress can defund the war. The president will just, will obey the Constitution. He doesn't seem to be inclined to do that very often. And there was another scenario as well. So what we tried to do is to add to the common knowledge on this. And it was our piece was published on a number of websites. The first one was consortiumnews.com, run by Bob Perry, who's about the best investigative reporter you're going to find around. A lot of influence in the mainstream press, and now with his own website, consortiumnews.com.
All right, so wrap up your views on what's happening in the Middle East and the war there, because as you had written about previously, the Congress didn't do anything when it came to funding, and they keep making these token gestures.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of our VIPS folks, Ray Close, who he grew up in Beirut. He spent most of his life in the Middle East. He was our chief of station in Saudi Arabia. He's written recently that this funding for more and more armaments is really a self-defeating, very myopic view. We're going to give the Saudis several $1 billion more armaments. We're going to give the Israelis the most sophisticated armaments, and then we're going to fund some armaments for Egypt as well. It's going to do no good because everyone knows that Israel gets the creme de la creme of our arms and that the others will be in second fiddle. And who profits from all this? Well, you've heard about the military-industrial complex. I had always sort of known about this since General Eisenhower had said it in his farewell address and had warned about it. But I had a congressman over brunch just 3 weeks ago look me in the eye and say, Ray, I was trying to get him to explain, for example, why it was that a provision that he had written into some bills was deleted. The provision was simply that the U.S. would not be permitted to attack Iran without explicit prior permission from the U.S. Congress. It's sort of just what the Constitution says, right? Well, he had that language in the bill. It was struck out, okay? It was struck out after the main Israel lobby came to Washington, AIPAC, and circulated throughout the halls of Washington. And we know for a fact that it was AIPAC's influence that got that out of there. How do we know? Because Pelosi's first assistant told us that, okay? It was AIPAC. So this is just a kind of a reality that one has to face. And it's just very, very difficult to get anything done in this area without facing up to this and to put things into perspective and have a very objective approach, which is lacking right now. So what Ray Close has been saying is that what will happen here is that the Saudis won't be deceived, the Egyptians won't be deceived, the Jordanians won't be deceived. They're getting sort of the second-rate arms, billions and billions worth. But what the congressman said to me, as I asked him to try to explain this to me, he said, Ray, you've heard about the military-industrial complex? I said, sure. He said, well, it's real, okay? Do you hear me? It's real, okay? And said to myself, wow, what's he trying to tell me? The congressman was Jim McDermott, whom I have terrific respect for, and who's one of the very best, one of the most ethical, and got his head screwed on right. He is one of the people who have co-sponsored Kucinich's bill to impeach Cheney first, and there are about 20 co-sponsors of that now. So that's the answer. In sum, I would just say that I'm a Virginian, and never have I been so conscious of people like James Madison, George Mason, not to even mention Tom Jefferson or Patrick Henry, people who put their lives at risk, people who wrote our Constitution in such a way that never would it be possible, as in the Old English tradition, that a king would be able to arbitrarily decide things like sending people off to war, okay? For their own good, of course, but they wouldn't be able to do that. And now to see our representatives and senators, including the distinguished senior senator from Virginia, John Warner, who was head of the Armed Services Committee and refused to investigate Abu Ghraib because there was an election coming up. My vision is that these founders of our Constitution and our country, especially James Madison and George Mason, who did this incredible document that is universally applauded throughout the world, they're turning over in their graves. Why? Well, they're saying, well, look, hey, fellas, don't you remember that 6 times we put into that Constitution, that basic document, what you do when a president starts acting like a king? They were very perspicacious. They looked down the centuries and they said, look, human nature being what it is, it's inevitable. At some point, some president is going to think he can act like a king. And so we'll write into this basic document an orderly procedure, a political procedure to contend with that sort of situation. And it's called impeachment. Impeachment. Do not blanch before it. Impeachment, okay? They didn't want to have another revolution. That one is quite enough, thank you very much. And they didn't want a military junta or something like that. And so here's this provision, and here's a person like John Conyers, who was on the committee that virtually impeached Nixon, for some reason abnegating their constitutional responsibility to do the right thing and to proceed in an orderly way to impeach the vice president and the president. Now, we've talked to Conyers, and I have to say how greatly disappointed I am. It's very clear that for crass political considerations, namely the election in 2008, they're prepared to let this thing go on, to include the killing of thousands more of our own troops and countless tens of thousands of Iraqis, for example. So if there's not enough grounds to constitute high crimes and misdemeanors now, when a president arbitrarily lies to Congress to get them to approve an unnecessary war in Iraq, I don't know what's necessary to impeach a president. So this is the solution. I'm somewhat encouraged that some representatives are facing up to this now. As I say, Kucinich's bill has about 20 co-sponsors, and I just hope that Conyers and others will have a change in heart and obey the oath they took, that I took as an Army officer, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Mike.